Hello and welcome to Brig Speak. I am Brigadier Rakesh Bhatia. The inputs for today's episode I have taken from chapter number 3 of the prescribed book, Hanoi and Beijing on the Road to War, and chapters Beijing, Hanoi, and Indo-China Steps to the Clash, and Between a Rock and a Hard Place, Hanoi, Beijing, and the Superpower, 1954 to 1975 of the recommended book Dragons Entangled. The relationship between China and Vietnam has not been very comfortable. Though they have coexisted for many years, they call themselves as comrades in arms, but their relationship can be summed up by a Chinese proverb which says, it takes more than one cold day for a river to freeze 3 feet deep. I will first give you a small background. Vietnam and China have not been very friendly neighbors, but they formed alliances against common enemies. And the common enemies from 46 to 54 was the French and the US from 1955 to 1975 in the first and the second Indo-China War. Between 1965 and 1969, 320,000 Chinese troops served in North Vietnam. This included military advisors, engineers who constructed bridges, even PLA Air Force operated on behalf of North Vietnam, fighting the US backed South Vietnam troops. At one time, 170,000 were deployed in Vietnam. 1,100 Chinese died and about 4,300 were wounded in Vietnam. Now, Vietnams were under the impression that Chinese forces in North Vietnam were working to a plan. They wanted to assess the state of defenses for an eventual invasion and occupation of Vietnam. They felt that China would use Vietnam as a base for expansion across Southeast Asia. There were four major reasons for the conflict between Beijing and Hanoi. One was the unequal characteristics of Sino-Vietnam relations with respect to communism. Now, this has been covered in the episode named Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism. You are requested to go through this video. Moscow's lack of geopolitical interest in Indo-China created a leadership vacuum, which both China and Vietnam wanted to. This has been covered in detail in ideological differences between China and Vietnam. Now, Mao had very radical ideas about how communism should be spread in the world. He wanted to use violence for the purpose. This was reflected in China's foreign and security policy. There was a Sino-Soviet split in 60s. But this raised concern amongst the Chinese about the Soviet threat. The actions taken by China was to ensure its own security against a possible Soviet invasion in China. Let's talk about perception both countries had about each other. Vietnamese felt that Chinese divided Vietnam at the Geneva Conference in 1954. Geneva Conference was held when French were leaving Indochina, and the outcome of Geneva Convention was that Vietnam was divided into two countries, North and South. More details we'll cover slightly later. Vietnam also felt that China always opposed reunification till 70s also. Vietnamese had a feeling that China has tried to limit Vietnamese influence in Laos and Cambodia by supporting those regimes against Vietnam. The Chinese authorities were suspected by the Vietnamese that they want to topple the current government in order to bring it under Chinese control. Lastly, that China wants to control Southeast Asia and views Vietnam and Soviet Union as a threat to these designs. Similarly, China had certain perceptions about Vietnam. China felt that Vietnam wanted to create an Indo-China federation by turning Laos and Cambodia into its colonies. By supporting Soviets, Vietnam is being used to present a multi-front north, northeast, and south threat to China. China had a military alliance with Mongolia. Chinese-Soviet border in northeast was under dispute. Soviets also had a boundary along the Xinjiang province of China in northwest. Now, due to Soviet-Vietnam alliance, there was yet another front which was likely to be used by Soviet to threaten China. Let's try and find answer to the question, why did China invade Vietnam? The commonly quoted reasons for the Chinese attack are there were border clashes along the Sino-Vietnam border. In 75, there were 439 cases of clashes, which increased to three times, that is 986 in 1976. Prior to this, in 74, Chinese had already taken the Parasil Island, which is in South China Sea, from Vietnam's possession. Another trigger for this war was repatriation of ethnic Chinese from Vietnam. In our episode on Chinese Vietnam Historical Connect, we had said that a lot of ethnic Chinese had moved into Vietnam. Many of them were involved in business. In 1977, to curb the economic influence of these ethnic Chinese population, there was a campaign against the Comprador Borgois. Borgois word means elite people. This campaign was launched in Saigon. Next year, there was another campaign to transform private industry and commerce. Now, this campaign declared private enterprise illegal, and it also revised the currency laws. Hoa. Hoa is the way the ethnic Chinese are referred to in Vietnam. Their traditional way of life was destroyed, and their saving was reduced to nothing. Beijing charged Hanoi with deliberately seeking forced expulsion of Hoa from Vietnam. Now, this developed crisis of trust between the two nations. As a consequence of this action by Vietnam, China had cut down its aid to Vietnam. And as a reaction to cutting down of aid, Vietnam decided to join Soviet-sponsored Council of Mutual Economic Assistance. This was the beginning of separation from Beijing and increasing closeness to Mao. Following the Soviet-Vietnam Treaty, China decided to quote US. And these came as major triggers for the upcoming war. We have already spoken about Vietnam's admission in Moscow-based economic organization. In 78 only, there was a treaty of friendship and cooperation between Soviets and Vietnam. The executive para of that was that in case either party is attacked, the two parties, that is, Soviet Union and Vietnam, shall consult each other to eliminate that threat. In Cambodia, Kampuchean National United Front for National Salvation was raised by Vietnam to overthrow Pol Pot. Details of this have been covered in our podcast, namely why Vietnam invaded Cambodia. Chinese accused Vietnam of creating this organization to support Vietnam's military offensive against Cambodia. And again, coming to the same thing, that they want to realize their long cherished dream of regional hegemony, that is, to rule over Indo-China. Now, this is the time China decided to get into the camp of the USA. The executive para of the communication of the US-China meeting said that we will oppose efforts by any other country or group of countries to establish hegemony in the Asia Pacific region. So it became a confrontation between two alliances, that is US and China on one side versus Soviet Union and Vietnam on the other side, resulting in polarizing effect in Sino-Vietnamese. On the other hand, under Stalin, Soviet continued to expand to Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia. This is the map. In the red color is USSR, pink color depicts Warsaw countries, and the lighter pink depicts countries which were aligned to the USSR. China also needed to take corrective measures for self defense, counterattack, or active defense. Now, whenever China says about counterattack, he feels that China never goes into attack. It only counters a attack undertaken by the adversary. Now, why China decided to have reconciliation with USA? Because China's foreign policy at that time focused on breaking the US policy of isolation. China was undergoing economic crisis. They had already broken away from Russia, who was helping them to establish industries. The Chinese realized in order to develop economically, they would need a superpower. Split with Russia had already taken place. They had no option but to join the camp of capitalist USA. That is why the famous visit by Henry Kissinger took place in 1971, and later Richard Nixon, who was the president, himself traveled to China, which raised major concerns all around. Now let's see what were the spoilers of China-Vietnam relations. We already seen in the slide on perceptions that Vietnam always felt that China wanted to divide Vietnam because China feared that united Vietnam might dominate Indo-China. According to Vietnamese, Zhou Enlai, who was their premier as well as foreign minister, as chief negotiator in the Geneva Convention, which had taken place in 1954, pressurized Vietnamese to accept the 17th parallel post First Indo-China War. Through their official press, China was continuously warning Vietnam that Laos and Cambodia should remain independent. China also wanted to increase its influence into Laos and Cambodia to offset Vietnamese influence as well as limit Soviet in this region. Vietnamese considered themselves to be cornerstone of Indo-China's communist movement, whereas Mao considered himself as the greatest leader after death of Stalin in 1953. Summary of these relation spoilers: Hanoi and Beijing considered each other to be the main obstacle to increasing each other's interest in Indochina. Hanoi is leaning towards Moscow. Beijing closed Vietnamese consulate in Kunming, Guangzhou, and Nanning. This began the diplomatic battle between the two countries. In return, Vietnam Communist Party, they removed the party members of the Vietnam Communist Party who were considered sympathetic to Chinese policy and were critical of Moscow. This was yet another signal to China that there is enough wedge between the relationship of the two countries. To conclude, I would say that Vietnam served as a cockpit for the growing showdown between China and the Soviet Union over their interpretations of Marxist Leninist ideologies and also policies towards the West, particularly the United States. With this, I come to the end of today's episode. I'll request you to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you very much, and Jai Hind.